In 1945, Nazi Germany surrendered. The history books credit brilliant generals, brave soldiers, and one particular group, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, who cracked the Enigma machine. But they missed someone. A woman working from a cramped office in Washington, D.C. A woman who broke codes the Nazis thought were unbreakable. A woman who dismantled entire spy networks, saved thousands of lives, and helped win the war. Her name was Elizebeth Smith Friedman, and for 50 years, her story was classified, buried, and deliberately erased from history. Today, we're opening the archive. Let's rewind to 1916. Elizebeth Smith wasn't supposed to be a codebreaker. She was a 23-year-old English literature graduate from a Quaker family in Indiana, working at the Newberry Library in Chicago. She loved Shakespeare, poetry, and had dreams of becoming a teacher. Then one day, a wealthy, eccentric millionaire named George Fabian approached her with an unusual job offer. Fabian had built a private research facility called Riverbank Laboratories outside Chicago, part scientific estate, part bizarre experimental playground. He was obsessed with proving that Francis Bacon had secretly written Shakespeare's plays using hidden codes. It sounds absurd. It was absurd. But Elizebeth needed the money. She took the job. At Riverbank, she met William Friedman, a geneticist who also got roped into Fabian's Shakespeare conspiracy. While searching for codes that didn't exist in Elizabeth's favorite plays, something unexpected happened. She discovered she had a gift for seeing patterns where others saw chaos. Elizebeth and William fell in love, not just with each other, but with cryptology itself. They got married in 1917 and became America's first power couple of code-breaking. Then World War I broke out, and suddenly, their unusual skills became desperately needed. The US government had virtually no code-breaking capability. So they turned to Riverbank. Elizebeth found herself decrypting German military communications, unraveling spy networks, and solving codes that trained military analysts couldn't crack. She was 24 years old. When the war ended in 1918, most people went back to normal life. But Elizebeth had found her calling. She had proven something. Codes could be broken systematically, scientifically. And she was just getting started. The 1920s arrived, and with them, prohibition. Suddenly, America's new enemy wasn't foreign soldiers. It was rum runners, bootleggers, and organized crime smuggling alcohol across borders and coastlines. These criminal networks used sophisticated radio codes to coordinate their operations. The U.S. Coast Guard and Treasury Department were overwhelmed. They couldn't break the codes. So they called Elizebeth Smith Friedman. For over a decade, Elizebeth became America's secret weapon against organized crime. Working from a small office in Washington, she single-handedly built the cryptanalysis unit that would later become the foundation for the NSA. She broke code after code. She testified in court, sending smugglers to prison with evidence they thought was impossible to obtain. She dismantled entire criminal networks across the Gulf Coast, the Pacific, and Canada. The criminals kept making their codes more complex. Elizebeth kept breaking them faster. By the 1930s, her reputation in law enforcement circles was legendary. But outside those circles, almost nobody knew her name. Then came a new threat, a much darker one. In 1938, as war clouds gathered over Europe, Elizebeth began intercepting radio messages that chilled her blood. Nazi spy networks were operating throughout South America. Hitler had a plan: infiltrate the Americas, gather intelligence, sabotage Allied efforts, and potentially invade. German spies were sending encrypted messages from Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Mexico back to Berlin using the same Enigma machines that were considered uncrackable. The FBI knew about the spy networks, but couldn't read their communications. British intelligence at Bletchley Park was focused on European Enigma traffic. The US military was understaffed and underfunded. So once again, they turned to Elizebeth. Working with a tiny team, sometimes just her and one assistant, Elizebeth took on the entire Nazi intelligence network in the Western Hemisphere. Over the next 7 years, she would break 48 different Enigma systems. Let me repeat that. 48 different Nazi Enigma codes. She identified hundreds of German agents. She traced their communications, mapped their networks, and fed intelligence that led to dozens of arrests. She uncovered Nazi plans to sabotage American ships, target military installations, and coordinate U-boat attacks. One of her biggest victories came in 1941, before America even entered the war. A German spy network in South America was planning to smuggle industrial diamonds, crucial for weapons manufacturing, out of Argentina to Berlin. Elizebeth intercepted and decrypted their communications, revealing the entire operation. The diamonds never reached Germany. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941 and America entered World War II, Elizebeth's work became even more critical. Nazi spies in South America were now trying to gather intelligence on American troop movements, ship convoys, and military production. Every message they sent, Elizebeth was reading. She worked 7 days a week, 16-hour days, breaking codes that Nazi intelligence officers believed were unbreakable. Her work was so sensitive that she operated under multiple layers of classification. Not even her husband, who by now was running the Army's cryptanalysis unit, could know all the details of what she was doing. By 1945, when the war ended, Elizebeth Smith Friedman had broken 48 Nazi Enigma systems, identified over 3,000 enemy messages, helped capture dozens of Nazi spies, prevented sabotage operations that could have cost thousands of Allied lives, and dismantled Hitler's entire intelligence network in South America. Her work was, without exaggeration, critical to Allied victory. So why don't you know her name? Here's where the story gets dark. When World War II ended, something strange happened. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, took credit for breaking the Nazi spy rings in South America. Not some credit, all of it. Hoover held press conferences. The FBI published reports. They made it sound like their agents had brilliantly outmaneuvered German intelligence through traditional detective work. They never mentioned Elizebeth Smith Friedman. They never mentioned that a civilian woman, working for the Coast Guard and Treasury Department, had done the actual code breaking that made every single arrest possible. Why? Because Hoover didn't want the public knowing that the FBI couldn't break codes themselves. It would make them look weak, outdated, reliant on others. So he buried her. Elizebeth was furious, but her hands were tied. Her work was classified at the highest levels. She couldn't defend herself publicly. She couldn't tell journalists or historians the truth. National security, they told her. You understand. So she stayed silent, but it got worse. After the war, the US government conducted a massive review of wartime cryptology successes. They wrote official histories. They declassified certain operations. They celebrated the codebreakers at Bletchley Park. People like Alan Turing became household names. Elizebeth's files? They remained classified. In fact, many of her records were deliberately destroyed or lost by the agencies that wanted to take credit for her work. When historians wrote books about World War II code-breaking, they focused on Enigma breakthroughs in Europe, which were genuinely important. But they missed half the story. Nobody knew that Enigma had been broken in the Americas too, by a woman, working with a skeleton crew and almost no resources. Elizabeth retired from government service in 1946. She was 53 years old. She had spent 30 years breaking codes, winning wars, and saving lives. And almost nobody knew. She tried to set the record straight. She gave a few interviews. She wrote letters to historians, gently correcting the record. But without access to her classified files, she couldn't prove most of what she'd done. In 1980, Elizebeth Smith Friedman died at age 88. The New York Times obituary mentioned her work during Prohibition. It briefly noted she'd done intelligence work during World War II. That was it. The woman who broke 48 Nazi Enigma systems got a 3-paragraph obituary that barely mentioned her greatest achievements. For years, that's where the story ended. Elizabeth was a footnote if she appeared at all. But then something happened. In the 1990s and 2000s, the US government began systematically declassifying World War II intelligence records. Slowly, carefully, the files started opening, and historians began finding Elizabeth's work. Thousands of pages, detailed reports, intercepted messages, evidence of operations nobody knew existed. A researcher named Jason Fagone spent years piecing together her story from declassified archives, family papers, and forgotten records. In 2017, he published a book called The Woman Who Smashed Codes. Finally, the full truth came out. Elizabeth Smith Friedman wasn't just a talented codebreaker. She was one of the most important intelligence operatives of the 20th century. She'd invented techniques that became foundational to modern cryptanalysis. She'd trained a generation of codebreakers. She'd proven that systematic scientific approaches could break codes previously thought unbreakable. And she'd done it all while fighting not just enemy spies, but institutional sexism, credit-stealing bosses, and a government that wanted to pretend she didn't exist. Today, the NSA has finally acknowledged her contributions. There's an exhibit about her at their National Cryptologic Museum. A few books have been written. Some historians now include her in the story of World War II codebreaking. But ask most people about Enigma, and they'll mention Alan Turing, Bletchley Park, maybe the Imitation Game movie. Almost nobody knows about Elizabeth Smith Friedman. She broke more Enigma systems than almost anyone else in the war, and history forgot her. Elizabeth once said, "The history of codes and ciphers is the history of the centuries-old battle between codemakers and codebreakers, an intellectual arms race that has had a significant impact on the course of human events." She was right, and she was on the front lines of that battle for 30 years. Her story raises an uncomfortable question. How many other brilliant people, especially women, did history erase? How many other untold stories are sitting in archives, waiting to be discovered? This is why Untold Archives exists, to find those stories, to bring them back to light. If you want more forgotten history, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Next week, we're uncovering another story they didn't teach you in school. The archives are open. Let's explore them together.